Chapter 27, Part 2 of Children of the Ghetto by Israel Zangwill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 27, The Shadow of Religion, Part 2. For an instant David was overwhelmed by the quotation, for the Bible was still a sacred book to him. Then he cried indignantly, "But God never meant it to apply to a case like this." "We must obey God's law," said Reb Shemuel. "Then it's the devil's law," shouted David, losing all control of himself. The Reb's face grew dark as night. There was a moment of dread silence. "Here you are, father," said Hannah, returning with the wine and some glasses, which she had carefully dusted. Then she paused and gave a little cry, nearly losing her hold of the tray. "What's the matter? What has happened?" she asked anxiously. "Take the wine away. We shall drink nobody's health tonight," said David brutally. "My God!" said Hannah, all the hue of happiness dying out of her cheeks. She threw down the tray on the table and ran to her father's arms. "What is it? Oh, what is it, father?" she cried. "You haven't had a quarrel?" The old man was silent. The girl looked appealingly from one to the other. "No, it's worse than that," said David in cold, harsh tones. "You remember your marriage in fun to Sam?" "Yes, merciful heavens, I guess it. There was something not valid in the get after all." Her anguish at the thought of losing him was so apparent that he softened a little. "No, not that," he said more gently. "But this blessed religion of ours reckons you a divorced woman, so you can't marry me because I'm a Cohen." "Can't marry you 'cause you're a Cohen?" replied Hannah, dazed in her turn. "We must obey the Torah," said Reb Shemuel again in low, solemn tones. "It is your friend Levine who has erred, not the Torah." "The Torah can't visit a mere bit of fun so cruelly," protested David, "and on the innocent too." "Sacred things should not be jested with," said the old man in stern tones that yet quavered with sympathy and pity. "On his head is the sin, on his head is the responsibility." "Father," cried Hannah in piercing tones, "can nothing be done?" The old man shook his head sadly. The poor pretty face was pallid with a pain too deep for tears. The shock was too sudden, too terrible. She sank helplessly into a chair. "Something must be done. Something shall be done," thundered David. "I will appeal to the chief rabbi." "And what could he do? Can he go behind the Torah?" said Reb Shemuel pitifully. "I won't ask him to, but if he has a grain of common sense, he'll see that our case is an exception and cannot come under the law." "The law knows no exceptions," said Reb Shemuel gently, quoting in Hebrew. "The law of God is perfect, enlightening the eyes. Be patient, my dear children, in your affliction. It is the will of God. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Bless ye the name of the Lord." "Not I," said David harshly. "But look to Hannah, she's fainted." "No, I'm all right," said Hannah wearily, opening the eyes she had closed. "Do not make so certain, father. Look at your books again. Perhaps they do make an exception in such a case." The Reb shook his head hopelessly. "Do not expect that," he said. "Believe me, my Hannah, if there were a gleam of hope, I would not hide it from you. Be a good girl, dear, and bear your trouble like a true Jewish maiden. Have faith in God, my child. He doeth all things for the best. Come now, rouse yourself, tell David you will always be a friend, and that your father will love him as though he were indeed his son." He moved towards her and touched her tenderly. He felt a violent spasm traversing her bosom. "I can't, father," she cried in a choking voice. "I can't. Don't ask me." David leaned against the manuscript-littered table in stony silence. The stern granite faces of the old continental rabbis seemed to frown down on him from the walls, and he returned the frown with interest. His heart was full of bitterness, contempt, revolt. What a pack of knavish bigots they must all have been! Reb Shemuel bent down and took his daughter's head in his trembling palms. The eyes were closed again. The chest heaved painfully with silent sobs. "Do you love him so much, Hannah?" whispered the old man. Her sobs answered, growing loud at last. "But you love your religion more, my child," he murmured anxiously. "That will bring you peace." Her sobs gave him no assurance. Presently the contagion of sobbing took him too. Oh God, he moaned. "What sin have I committed that thou should punish my child thus?" "Don't blame God," burst forth David at last. "It's your own foolish bigotry. Is it not enough your daughter doesn't ask to marry a Christian? Be thankful, old man, for that, and put away all this antiquated superstition. We're living in the 19th century. "And what if we are?" said Reb Shemuel, blazing up in turn. "The Torah is eternal. Thank God for your youth and your health and strength, and do not blaspheme him, for you cannot have all the desire of your heart, all the inclination of your eyes." "The desire of my heart," retorted David. "Do you imagine I'm only thinking of my own suffering? Look at your daughter. Think of what you're doing to her, and beware before it's too late." "Is it in my hand to do or to forbear?" asked the old man. "It is the Torah. Am I responsible for that?" "Yes," said David out of mere revolt. Then, seeking to justify himself, his face lit up with sudden inspiration. "Whoever need know? The Maggid is dead. Old Hyams has gone to America. So Hannah has told me. It's 1,000 to 1, Leah's people never heard of the law of Leviticus. Even if they had, it's another 1,000 to 1 against their putting 2 and 2 together. It requires a Talmudist like you to even dream of reckoning Hannah as an ordinary divorced woman. If they did, it's a third 1,000 to 1 against their telling anybody. There's no need for you to perform the ceremony yourself. Let her be married by some other minister, by the chief rabbi himself. And to make assurance doubly sure, I'll not mention that I'm a Cohen." The words poured forth like a torrent, overwhelming the Reb for a moment. Hannah leapt up with a hysterical cry of joy. "Yes, yes, father. It will be all right after all. Nobody knows. Oh, thank God, thank God." There was a moment of tense silence. Then the old man's voice rose slowly and painfully. "Thank God," he repeated. "Do you dare mention the name even when you propose to profane it? Do you ask me, your father, Reb Shemuel, to consent to such a profanation of the name?" "And why not?" said David angrily. "Whom else has the daughter the right to ask mercy from, if not from her father?" "God have mercy on me," groaned the old Reb, covering his face with his hands. "Come, come," said David impatiently. "Be sensible. It's nothing unworthy of you at all. Hannah was never really married, so cannot really be divorced. We only ask you to obey the spirit of the Torah instead of the letter." The old man shook his head, unwavering. His cheeks were white and wet, but his expression was stern and solemn. "Just think! What, am I better than any other Jew? Than yourself, for instance, that I shouldn't marry a divorced woman?" "It is the law. You are a Cohen, a priest." "A priest! Oh!" laughed David bitterly. "A priest in the 19th century, when the temple has been destroyed these 2000 years. It will be rebuilt, please God," said Reb Shemuel. "We must be ready for it. Oh, yes, I'll be ready. Oh, a priest, holy unto the Lord, I, a priest. Oh, do you know what my holiness consists in? In eating treifa meat, in going to shul a few times a year. And I am too holy to marry your daughter. Ah, that is rich." He ended in uncontrollable mirth, slapping his knee in ghastly enjoyment. His laughter rang terrible. Reb Shemuel trembled from head to foot. Hannah's cheek was drawn and white. She seemed overwrought beyond endurance. There followed a silence only less terrible than David's laughter. "A Cohen!" burst forth David again. "A holy Cohen up to date. Do you know what the boys say about us priests when we're blessing you common people? They say that if you look on us once during that sacred function, you go blind, and if you look at us a second time, you'll die. A nice reverent joke that, eh? Ha! You're blind already, Reb Shemuel. Beware you don't look at me again, or I'll commence to bless you. Ha!" Again the terrible silence. "Ah, well," David resumed, his bitterness welling forth in irony. "And so the first sacrifice the priest is called upon to make is that of your daughter. But I won't, Reb Shemuel. Mark my words, I won't. Not till she offers her own throat to the knife. If she and I are parted, on you and you alone the guilt must rest. You will have to perform the sacrifice." "What God wishes me to do, I will do," said the old man in a broken voice. "What is it to that which our ancestors suffered for the glory of the name?" "Yes, but it seems you suffer by proxy," retorted David savagely. "My God, do you think I would not have died to make my Hannah happy?" faltered the old man. "But God has laid the burden on her, and I can only help her to bear it. Now, sir, I must beg you to go. You do but distress my child." "What say you, Hannah? Do you want me to go?" "Yes. What is the use now?" breathed Hannah through white quivering lips. "My child," said the old man pitifully, while he strained her to his breast. "All right," said David in strange, harsh tones, scarcely recognizable as his. "I see you are your father's daughter." He took his hat and turned his back upon the tragic embrace. "David!" She called his name in an agonized, hoarse voice. She held her arms towards him. He did not turn round. "David!" Her voice rose to a shriek. "You will not leave me?" He faced her exultant. "Ah, you will come with me? You will be my wife?" "No, no, not now. I cannot answer you now. Let me think. Good-bye, dearest. Good-bye." She burst out weeping. David took her in his arms and kissed her passionately. Then he went out hurriedly. Hannah wept on, her father holding her hand in piteous silence. "Oh, it is cruel, your religion," she sobbed. "Cruel, cruel." "Hannah? Shmuel? Where are you?" Suddenly came the excited voice of Simcha from the passage. "Come and look at the lovely fowls I brought. And such metzias, they're worth double. Oh, what a beautiful Yom Tov we shall have." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28. Part 1 of Children of the Ghetto by Israel Zangwill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 28, Seder Night, Part 1. Prosaic miles of street stretch all around, astir with restless, hurried life, and spanned by arches that with thunderous trains resound, and throbbing wires that galvanize the land. Gin palaces in tawdry splendor stand. The newsboys shriek of mangled bodies found. The last burlesque is playing in the Strand. In modern prose all poetry seems drowned. Yet in 10,000 homes this April night an ancient people celebrates its birth to freedom with reverential mirth, with customs quaint and many a hoary rite, waiting until its tarnished glories bright, its God shall be the God of all the earth. To an imaginative child like Esther, Seder night was a charmed time. The strange symbolic dishes, the bitter herbs, the sweet mixture of apples, almonds, spices and wine, the roasted bone and the lamb, the salt water and the 4 cups of raisin wine, the great round unleavened cakes with their mottled surfaces, some specially thick and sacred, the special Hebrew melodies and verses with their jingle of rhymes and assonances, the quaint ceremonial with its striking moments, as when the finger was dipped in the wine and the drops sprinkled over the shoulder in repudiation of the 10 plagues of Egypt, cabalistically magnified to 250. All this penetrated deep into her consciousness, and made the recurrence of every Passover coincide with a rush of pleasant anticipations and a sense of the special privilege of being born a happy Jewish child. Vaguely, indeed, did she coordinate the celebration with the history enshrined in it, or with the prospective history of her race. It was like a tale out of the fairy books, this miraculous deliverance of her forefathers in the dim haze of antiquity. True enough, but not more definitely realized on that account. And yet not easily dissoluble links were being forged with her race, which has anticipated positivism in vitalizing history by making it religion. The matzah that Esther ate were not dainty. They were coarse, of the quality called seconds. For even the unleavened bread of charity is not necessarily delicate eating. But few things melted sweeter on the palate than a segment of a matzah dipped in cheap raisin wine. The unconventionality of the food made life less common, more picturesque. Simple ghetto children into whose existence the ceaseless round of fast and feast prohibited and enjoyed pleasures of varying species of food brought change and relief. Imprisoned in the area of a few narrow streets, unlovely and sombre, muddy and ill-smelling, immured in dreary houses, and surrounded with mean and depressing sights and sounds, the spirit of childhood took radiance and colour from its own inner light, and the alchemy of youth could still transmute its lead into gold. No little princess in the courts of fairyland could feel a fresher interest and pleasure in life than Esther sitting at the Seder table, where her father, no longer a slave in Egypt, leaned royally upon 2 chairs supplied with pillows, as the Beth Din prescribes. Not even the monarch's prime minister could have had a meaner opinion of Pharaoh than Moses Ansell in this symbolically sybaritic attitude. A live dog is better than a dead lion, as a great teacher in Israel had said. How much better than a live lion than a dead dog? Pharaoh, for all his purple and fine linen and his treasure cities, was at the bottom of the Red Sea, smitten with 250 plagues, and even if, as the tradition asserted, he had been made to live on and to be king of Nineveh, and to give ear to the warnings of Jonah the prophet and whale explorer, even so he was but ashes and dust for other sinners to cover themselves withal. But he, Moses Ansell, was the honoured master of his household, enjoying a foretaste of the lollings of the righteous in paradise, nay more, dispensing hospitality to the poor and the hungry. Little fleas have lesser fleas, and Moses Ansell had never fallen so low that, on this night of nights when the slave sits with the master on equal terms, he could manage to entertain a Passover guest, usually some newly arrived greener or some nondescript waif and stray returned to Judaism for the occasion, and accepting a seat at the board in that spirit of camaraderie that is one of the most delightful features of the Jewish pauper. Seder was a ceremonial to be taken in none too solemn and sober a spirit, and there was an abundance of unreproved giggling throughout from the little ones, especially in those happy days when mother was alive and tried to steal the afikomen, or matzah specially laid aside for the final morsel, only to be surrendered to father when he promised to grant her whatever she wished. Alas! It is to be feared Mrs. Ansell's wishes did not soar high. There was more giggling when the youngest son, it was poor Benjamin in Esther's early recollections, opened the ball by inquiring in a particularly pitched incantation and with an air of blank ignorance why this night differed from all other nights, in view of the various astonishing peculiarities of food and behaviour, enumerated in detail, visible to his vision. Manishtana haloila hazeh mikol halelos, to which Moses and the Bubbi and the rest of the company, including the questioner, invariably responded in corresponding sing-song, "Slaves have we been in Egypt," proceeding to recount at great length, stopping for refreshment in the middle, the never-cloying tale of the great deliverance, with irreverent digressions concerning Haman and Daniel and the wise men of Bona Barak, the whole of this most ancient of the world's extant domestic rituals terminating with an allegorical ballad like the House That Jack Built, concerning a kid that was eaten by a cat, which was bitten by a dog, which was beaten by a stick, which was burned by a fire, which was quenched by some water, which was drunk by an ox, which was slaughtered by a slaughterer, who was slain by the angel of death, who was slain by the Holy One, Baruch Hu. In wealthy houses this Haggadah was read from manuscripts with rich illuminations, the one development of pictorial art among the Jews, but the Ansells had wretchedly printed little books containing quaint but unintentionally comic woodcuts, pre-Raphaelite in perspective and ludicrous in draftsmanship, depicting the miracles of the redemption, Moses burying the Egyptian, and sundry other passages of the text. In one, a king was praying in the temple to an exploding bomb intended to represent the Shekinah, or divine glory. In another, Sarah, attired in her matronly cap and a fashionable jacket and skirt, was standing behind the door of the tent, a solid detached villa on the brink of a lake, whereupon ships and gondolas floated. What time Abraham welcomed the three celestial messengers, unobtrusively disguised with heavy pinions. What delight as the quaking of each of the 4 cups of wine loomed into sight. What disappointment and mutual bantering when the cup had merely to be raised in the hand. What chaff of the greedy Solomon, who was careful not to throw away a drop during the digital manoeuvres when the wine must be jerked from the cup at the mention of each plague. And what a solemn moment was that when the tallest goblet was filled to the brim for the delectation of the prophet Elijah, and the door thrown open for his entry. Could one almost hear the rustling of the prophet's spirit through the room? And what though the level of the wine subsided not a barleycorn? Elijah, though there was no difficulty in his being in all parts of the world simultaneously, could hardly compass the greater miracle of emptying so many million goblets. Historians have traced this custom of opening the door to the necessity of asking the world to look in and see for itself that no blood of Christian child figured in the ceremonial. And for once science has illuminated naive superstition with a tragic glow more poetic still. For the London Ghetto, persecution had dwindled to an occasional bellowing through the keyhole, as the local rowdies heard the unaccustomed melodies trolled forth from jocund lungs, and then the singers would stop for a moment, startled, and someone would say, "Oh, it's only a Christian rough," and take up the thread of song. And then, when the afikumen had been eaten and the last cup of wine drunk, and it was time to go to bed, what a sweet sense of sanctity and security still reigned. No need to say your prayers tonight, beseeching the guardian of Israel, who neither slumbereth nor sleepeth, to watch over you, and to chase away the evil spirits. The angels are with you, Gabriel on your right, and Raphael on your left, and Michael behind you. All about the Ghetto the light of the Passover rested, transfiguring the dreary rooms and illuminating the grey lives. Dutch Debbie sat beside Mrs. Simmons at the table of that good soul's married daughter, the same who had suckled little Sarah. Esther's frequent eulogiums had secured the poor, lonely, narrow-chested seamstress this enormous concession and privilege. Bobby squatted on the mat in the passage, ready to challenge Elijah. At this table there were 2 pieces of fried fish sent to Mrs. Simmons by Esther Ansell. They represented the greatest revenge of Esther's life, and she felt remorseful towards Malka, remembering to whose gold she owed this proud moment. She made up her mind to write her a letter of apology in her best hand. At the Belkoviches' the ceremonial was long, for the master of it insisted on translating the Hebrew into Yiddish phrase by phrase, but no one found it tedious, especially after supper. Pesach was there, hand in hand with Fanny, their wedding very near now, and Becky lolled royally in all her glory, aggressive of ringlet, insolently unattached, a conscious beacon of bedazzlement to the pauper Polak we last met at Reb Shmuel's Sabbath table. And there too was Chaya, she of the ill-matched legs. Be sure that Malka had returned the clothes-brush and was throned in complacent majesty at Milly's table, and that Sugarman the Shadchan forgave his monocular consort her lack of a 4th uncle, while Joseph Streletsky, dreamer of dreams, rich with commissions from Passover cigars, brooded on the great Exodus. Nor could the Shlotten Shammos be other than beaming, ordering the complex ceremonial with none to contradict, nor Karlhammer be otherwise than in the 777th heaven, which, calculated by Gematria, can easily be reduced to the 7th. Shoshi Shmendrik did not fail to explain the deliverance to the ex-widow Finkelstein, nor Gedalia the greengrocer omit to hold his annual revel at the head of 100 many pauper aliens. Christian roughs bawled derisively in the street, especially when doors were opened for Elijah, but hard words break no bones, and the Ghetto was uplifted above insult. Melchizedek Pinchas was the Passover guest at Reb Shmuel's table, for the reek of his Sabbath cigar had not penetrated the old man's nostrils. It was a great night for Pinchas, wrought up to fervid nationalistic aspirations by the memory of the Egyptian deliverance which he regarded as mythical in its details. It was a terrible night for Hannah, sitting opposite to him under the fire of his poetic regard. She was pale and rigid, moving and speaking mechanically. Her father glanced towards her every now and again, compassionately, but with trust that the worst was over. Her mother realized the crisis much less keenly than he, not having been in the heart of the storm. She had never even seen her intended son-in-law except through the lens of a camera. She was sorry, that was all. Now that Hannah had broken the ice and encouraged one young man, there was hope for the others. Hannah's state of mind was divined by neither parent. Love itself is blind in those tragic silences which divide souls. All night after that agonizing scene, she did not sleep. The feverish activity of her mind rendered that impossible, and unerring instinct told her that David was awake also, that they too, amid the silence of a sleeping city, wrestled in the darkness with the same terrible problem, and were never so much at one as in this their separation. A letter came for her in the morning, and had evidently been dropped into the letter-box by David's hand. It appointed an interview at 10 o'clock at the corner of the ruins. Of course he could not come to the house. Hannah was out with a little basket to make some purchases. There was a cheery hum of life about the Ghetto, a pleasant festival bustle. The air resounded with the raucous clucking of innumerable fowls on their way to the feather-littered, blood-stained shambles where professional cutthroats wielded sacred knives. Boys armed with little braziers of glowing coal ran about the ruins, offering halfpenny pyres for the immolation of the last crumbs of leaven. Nobody paid the slightest attention to the two tragic figures whose lives turned upon the brief moments of conversation snatched in the thick of the hurrying crowd. David's clouded face lighted a little as he saw Hannah advancing towards him. "I knew you would come," he said, taking her hand for a moment. His palm burned, hers was cold and limp. The stress of a great tempest of emotion had driven the blood from her face and limbs, but inwardly she was on fire. As they looked, each read revolt in the other's eyes. "Let us walk on," he said. They moved slowly forwards. The ground was slippery and muddy underfoot. The sky was grey, but the gaiety of the crowds neutralized the dull squalor of the scene. "Well?" he said in a low tone. "I thought you had something to propose," she murmured. "Let me carry your basket." "No, no, go on. What have you determined?" "Not to give you up, Hannah, while I live." "Ah," she said quietly, "I've thought it over too, and I shall not leave you. But our marriage by Jewish law is impossible. We could not marry at any synagogue without my father's knowledge, and he would at once inform the authorities of the bar to our union." "I know, dear, but let us go to America, where no one will know. There we shall find plenty of rabbis to marry us. There's nothing to tie me to this country. I can start my business in America just as well as here. Your parents, too, will think more kindly of you when you're across the seas. Forgiveness is easier at a distance. What do you say, dear?" She shook her head. "Why should we be married in a synagogue?" she asked. "Why?" repeated he, puzzled. "Yes, why?" "Because we are Jews." "You would use Jewish forms to outwit Jewish laws?" she asked quietly. "No, no. Why should you put it that way? I don't doubt the Bible is all right in making the laws it does. After the first heat of my anger was over, I saw the whole thing in its proper bearings. Those laws about priests were only intended for the days when we had a temple. And in any case, you can't apply a merely farcical divorce like yours. It's these old fools, oh, I beg your pardon, it's these fanatical rabbis who insist on giving them a rigidity that God never meant them to have, just as they still make a fuss about kosher meat. In America they are less strict. Besides, they will not know I'm a Cohen." "No, David," said Hannah firmly. "There must be no more deceit. What need have we to seek the sanction of any rabbi? If Jewish law cannot marry us without our hiding something, then I will have nothing to do with Jewish law. You know my opinions. I haven't gone so deeply into religious questions as you have." "Don't be sarcastic," he interrupted.
"I've always been sick to death of this eternal ceremony, this endless coil of laws winding round us and cramping our lives at every turn. And now it's become too oppressive to be borne any longer. Why should we let it ruin our lives? And why, if we determine to break from it, should we pretend to keep it? What do you care for Judaism? You eat trefa, and you smoke on Shabbos when you want to."
"Yes, I know, perhaps I'm wrong, but everybody does it nowadays. When I was a boy, no one dared to be seen riding a bus on Shabbos. Now you meet lots. But all that is an old-fashioned Judaism. There must be a God, else we shouldn't be here, and it's impossible to believe that Jesus was he. A man must have some religion, and there isn't anything better. But that's neither here nor there. If you don't care for my plan," he concluded anxiously, "what's yours?"
"Let us be married honestly, by a registrar."
"Any way you like, dear," he said readily, "so long as we are married, and quickly."
"As quickly as you like."
He seized her disengaged hand and pressed it passionately. "That's my own darling Hannah. Oh, if you could realize what I felt last night when you seemed to be drifting away from me." There was an interval of silence, each thinking excitedly. Then David said, "But have you the courage to do this and remain in London?"
"I have courage for anything. But, as you say, it might be better to travel. It will be less of a break if we break away altogether. Change everything at once. It sounds contradictory, but you understand what I mean."
"Perfectly. It's difficult to start a new life with all the old things round you. Besides, why should we give our friends the chance to cold-shoulder us? They will find all sorts of malicious reasons why we were not married in shul, and if they hit on the true one, they may even regard our marriage as illegal. Let's go to America, as I proposed."
"Very well. Do we go direct from London?"
"No, from Liverpool."
"Then we can be married at Liverpool before sailing."
"A good idea. But when do we start?"
"At once. Tonight. The sooner the better."
He looked at her quickly. "Do you mean it?" he said. His heart beat violently as if it would burst. Waves of dazzling colour swam before his eyes.
"I mean it," she said gravely and quietly. "Do you think I could face my father and mother, knowing I was about to wound them to the heart? Each day of delay would be torture to me. Oh, why is religion such a curse?"
She paused, overwhelmed for a moment by the emotion she had been suppressing. She resumed in the same quiet manner.
"Yes, we must break away at once. We have kept our last Passover. We shall have to eat leavened food. It will be a decisive break. Take me to Liverpool, David, this very day. You are my chosen husband. I trust in you."
She looked at him frankly with her dark eyes that stood out in lustrous relief against the pale skin. He gazed into those eyes, and a flash, as from the inner heaven of purity, pierced his soul. "Thank you, dearest," he said in a voice with tears in it. End of chapter 28, part 1. Chapter 28, Part 2, the last chapter of Children of the Ghetto by Israel Zangwill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 28, Seder Night, Part 2. They walked on silently. Speech was as superfluous as it was inadequate. When they spoke again, their voices were calm. The peace that comes of resolute decision was theirs at last, and each was full of the joy of daring greatly for the sake of their mutual love. Petty as their departure from convention might seem to the stranger, to them it loomed as a violent breach with all the traditions of the Ghetto and of their past lives. They were venturing forth into untrodden paths, holding each other's hand. Jostling the loquacious crowd in the unsavoury byways of the Ghetto, in the grey chillness of a cloudy morning, Hannah seemed to herself to walk in enchanted gardens, breathing the scent of love's own roses, mingled with the keen salt air that blew in from the sea of liberty. A fresh, new, blessed life was opening before her. The clogging vapours of the past were rolling away at last. The unreasoning, instinctive rebellion, bred of ennui and brooding dissatisfaction with the conditions of her existence and the people about her, had, by a curious series of accidents, been hastened to its acutest development. Thought had at last fermented into active resolution, and the anticipation of action flooded her soul with peace and joy, in which all recollection of outside humanity was submerged. "What time can you be ready to go by?" he said before they parted.
"Any time," she answered. "I can take nothing with me. I dare not pack anything. I suppose I can get necessaries in Liverpool. I have merely my hat and cloak to put on."
"But that will be enough," he said ardently. "I want but you."
"I know it, dear," she answered gently. "If you were as other Jewish young men, I could not give up all else for you." "You shall never regret it, Hannah," he said, moved to his depths, as the full extent of her sacrifice for love dawned upon him. He was a vagabond on the face of the earth, but she was tearing herself away from deep roots in the soil of home, as well as from the conventions of her circle and her sex. Once again he trembled with a sense of unworthiness, a sudden anxious doubt if he were noble enough to repay her trust. Mastering his emotion, he went on, "I reckon my packing and arrangements for leaving the country will take me all day at least. I must see my bankers, if nobody else. I shan't take leave of anybody. That would arouse suspicion. I will be at the corner of your street with a cab at 9, and will catch the 10 o'clock express from Euston. If we miss that, we should have to wait till midnight. It will be dark. No one's likely to notice me. I will get a dressing case for you and anything else I can think of and add it to my luggage." "Very well," she said simply. They did not kiss. She gave him her hand, and with a sudden inspiration he slipped the ring he had brought the day before on her finger. The tears came into her eyes as she saw what he had done. They looked at each other through a mist, feeling bound beyond human intervention. "Good-bye," she faltered. "Good-bye," he said. "At 9. "At 9," she breathed, and hurried off without looking behind. It was a hard day, the minutes crawling reluctantly into the hours dragging themselves wearily on towards the night. It was typical April weather, squalls and sunshine in capricious succession. When it drew towards dusk, she put on her best clothes for the festival
stuffing a few precious mementos into her pockets and wearing her father's portrait next to her lover's at her breast. She hung a travelling cloak and a hat on a peg near the hall door, ready to hand as she left the house. Of little use was she in the kitchen that day, but her mother was tender to her, knowing her sorrow. Time after time Hannah ascended to her bedroom to take a last look at the things she had grown so tired of: the little iron bed, the wardrobe, the framed lithographs, the jug and basin with their floral designs. All things seemed strangely dear now, as she was seeing them for the last time. Hannah turned over everything, even the little curling iron and the cardboard box full of rags and tags of ribbon and chiffon and lace and crushed artificial flowers, and the fans with broken sticks, and the stays with broken ribs, and the petticoats with dingy frills, and the 12-button ball gloves with dirty fingers, and the soiled pink wraps. Some of her books, especially her school prizes, she would have liked to take with her, but that could not be. She went over the rest of the house too, from top to bottom. It weakened her, but she could not conquer the impulse of farewell. Finally she wrote a letter to her parents and hid it under her looking-glass, knowing they would search her room for traces of her. She looked curiously at herself as she did so. The colour had not returned to her cheeks. She knew she was pretty, and always strove to look nice for the mere pleasure of the thing. All her instincts were aesthetic. Now she had the air of a saint, wrought up to spiritual exaltation. She was almost frightened by the vision. She had seen her face frowning, weeping, overcast with gloom, never with an expression so fateful. It seemed as if her resolution was writ large upon every feature for all to see. In the evening she accompanied her father to shul. She did not often go in the evening, and the thought of going only suddenly occurred to her. Heaven alone knew if she would ever enter a synagogue again. The visit would be part of her systematic farewell. Reb Shmuel took it as a symptom of resignation to the will of God, and he laid his hand lightly on her head in silent blessing, his eyes uplifted gratefully to heaven. Too late Hannah felt the misconception, and was remorseful. For the festival occasion Reb Shmuel had elected to worship at the great synagogue. Hannah, seated among the sparse occupants of the ladies' gallery, and mechanically fingering a machzor, looked down for the last time on the crowded auditorium, where the men sat in high hats and holiday garments. Tall wax candles twinkled everywhere, in great gilt chandeliers depending from the ceiling, in sconces stuck about the window ledges, in candelabra branching from the walls. There was an air of holy joy about the solemn old structure with its massive pillars, its small side windows, high ornate roof and skylights, and its gilt-lettered tablets to the memory of pious donors. The congregation gave the responses with joyous unction. Some of the worshippers tempered their devotion by petty gossip, and the beadle marshalled the men in low hats within the iron railings, sonorously sounding his automatic amens. But tonight Hannah had no idea for the humours that were wont to awaken her scornful amusement. A real emotion possessed her, the same emotion of farewell which she had experienced in her own bedroom. Her eyes wandered toward the ark, surmounted by the stone tablets of the Decalogue, and the sad dark orbs filled with the brooding light of childish remembrance. Once, when she was a little girl, her father had told her that on Passover night An angel sometimes came out of the doors of the ark from among the scrolls of the law. For years she had looked out for that angel, keeping her eyes patiently fixed on the curtain. At last she gave him up, concluding her vision was insufficiently purified, or that he was exhibiting at other synagogues. Tonight her childish fancy recurred to her. She found herself involuntarily looking towards the ark, and half expectant of the angel. She had not thought of the Seder service she would partially sit through when she made her appointment with David in the morning, but when during the day it occurred to her, a cynical smile traversed her lips. How apposite it was! Tonight would mark her exodus from slavery. Like her ancestors leaving Egypt, she too would partake of a meal in haste, staff in hand, ready for the journey. With what stout heart would she set forth, she too towards the promised land? Thus had she thought some hours since, but her mood was changed now. The nearer the Seder approached, the more she shrank from the family ceremonial. A panic terror almost seized her now in the synagogue, when the picture of the domestic interior flashed again before her mental vision. She felt like flying into the street or on towards her lover without ever looking behind. Oh, why could David not have fixed the hour earlier, so as to spare her an ordeal so trying to the nerves? The black-stoled choir was singing sweetly. Hannah banished her foolish flutter of alarm by joining in quietly, for congregational singing was regarded rather as an intrusion on the privileges of the choir, and calculated to put them out in their elaborate four-part fugues, unaided by an organ. With everlasting love hast thou loved the house of Israel thy people, she sang. A law and commandments, statutes and judgments hast thou taught us. Therefore, O Lord our God, when we lie down and when we rise up, we will meditate on thy statutes. Yea, we will rejoice in the words of thy law and in thy commandments forever. For they are our life and the length of our days, and will meditate on them day and night. And mayest thou never take away thy love from us. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who lovest thy people Israel. Hannah scanned the English version of the Hebrew in her Machzor as she sang. Though she could translate every word, the meaning of what she sang was never completely conceived by her consciousness. The power of song over the soul depends but little on the words. Now the words seem fateful, pregnant with special message. Her eyes were misty when the fugues were over. Again she looked towards the ark with its beautifully embroidered curtains, behind which were the precious scrolls in their silken swathes and their golden bells and shields and pomegranates. Ah, if the angel would come out now! If only the dazzling vision gleamed for a moment on the white steps! Oh, why did he not come and save her? Save her? From what? She asked herself the question fiercely, in defiance of the still small voice. What wrong had she ever done that she, so young and gentle, should be forced to make so cruel a choice between the old and the new? This was the synagogue she should have been married in, stepping gloriously and honourably under the canopy amid the pleasant excitement of a congratulatory company. And now she was being driven to exile and the chillness of secret nuptials. No, no, she did not want to be saved in the sense of being kept in the fold. It was the creed that was culpable, not she. The service drew to an end. The choir sang the final hymn, the chazan giving the last verse at great length and with many musical flourishes. The dead will God quicken in the abundance of his loving kindness. Blessed for evermore be his glorious name. There was a clattering of reading flaps and seat lids, and the congregation poured out amid the buzz of mutual good Yom Tovs. Hannah rejoined her father, the sense of injury and revolt still surging in her breast. In the fresh starlit air, stepping along the wet gleaming pavements, she shook off the last influences of the synagogue. All her thoughts converged on the meeting with David, on the wild flight northward, while good Jews were sleeping off the supper in celebration of their redemption. Her blood coursed quickly through her veins. She was in a fever of impatience for the hour to come. And thus it was as she sat at the Seder table, as in a dream, with images of desperate adventure flitting in her brain. The face of her lover floated before her eyes, close, close to her own, as it should have been tonight, had there been justice in heaven. Now and again the scene about her flashed in upon her consciousness, piercing her to the heart. When Levi asked the introductory question, it set her wondering what would become of him. Would manhood bring enfranchisement to him, as womanhood was doing to her? What sort of life would he lead the poor Reb and his wife? The omens were scarcely auspicious, but a man's charter is so much wider than a woman's, and Levi might do much without paining them, as she would pain them. Poor father! The white hairs were predominating in his beard. She had never noticed before how old he was getting. And mother, her face was quite wrinkled. Ah well, we must all grow old. And what a curious man Melchizedek Pinchas was, singing so heartily the wonderful story. Judaism certainly produced some curious types. A smile crossed her face as she thought of herself as his bride. At supper she strove to eat a little, knowing she would need it. In bringing some plates from the kitchen, she looked at her hat and cloak, carefully hung up on a peg in the hall nearest the street door. It would take but a second to slip them on. She nodded her head towards them, as who should say, "Yes, we shall meet again very soon." During the meal she found herself listening to the poet's monologues delivered in his high-pitched, creaking voice. Melchizedek Pinchas had much to say about a certain actor-manager who had spoiled the greatest jargon play of the century, and a certain labour leader who, out of the funds of his gulls, had subsidized the audience to stay away, and, though here the Reb cut him short for Hannah's sake, a certain leading lady, one of the quartet of mistresses of a certain clergyman, who had been beguiled by her paramour into joining the great English conspiracy to hound down Melchizedek Pinchas, all of whom he would shoot presently, and had in the meantime enshrined like dead flies in the amber of immortal acrostics. The wind began to shake the shutters as they finished supper, and presently the rain began to patter afresh against the panes. Reb Shmuel distributed the pieces of afikomen with a happy smile, and lolling on his pillows, and almost forgetting his family troubles in the sense of Israel's blessedness, began to chant the grace like the saints in the psalm who sing aloud on their couches. The little Dutch clock on the mantelpiece began to strike. Hannah did not move. Pale and trembling, she sat riveted to her chair. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She counted the strokes, as if to count them was the only means of telling the hour, as if her eyes had not been following the hands creeping, creeping. She had a mad hope the striking would cease with the 8, and there would still be time to think. 9. She waited, her ear longing for the 10th stroke. If it were only 10 o'clock, it would be too late. The danger would be over. She sat mechanically watching the hands. They crept on. It was 5 minutes past the hour. She felt that David was already at the corner of the street, getting wet and a little impatient. She half rose from her chair. It was not a nice night for an elopement. She sank back into her seat. Perhaps they had best wait till tomorrow night. She would go and tell David so. But then he would not mind the weather. Once they had met, he would bundle her into the cab, and they would roll on, leaving the old world irrevocably behind. She sat in a paralysis of volition, rigid on her chair, magnetized by the warm, comfortable room, the old familiar furniture, the Passover table with its white tablecloth and its decanter and wine glasses, the faces of her father and mother, eloquent with the appeal of 1,000 memories. The clock ticked on loudly, fiercely, like a summoning drum. The rain beat an impatient tattoo on the window frames. The wind rattled the doors and casements. Go forth, they called. Go forth where your lover awaits you, to bear you off into the new and unknown. And the louder they called, the louder Reb Shmuel trolled his hilarious grace. Osei shalom bimromav, hu ya'asei shalom. Aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru Romain. May he who maketh peace in the high heavens bestow peace upon us and upon all Israel, and say ye, Amen. The hands of the clock crept on. It was 9:30. Hannah sat lethargic, numb, unable to think, her strung-up nerves grown flaccid, her eyes full of bittersweet tears, her soul floating along as in a trance on the waves of a familiar melody. Suddenly she became aware that the others had risen and that her father was motioning to her. Instinctively she understood, rose automatically and went to the door. Then a great shock of returning recollection whelmed her soul. She stood rooted to the floor. Her father had filled Elijah's goblet with wine, and it was her annual privilege to open the door for the prophet's entry. Intuitively she knew that David was pacing madly in front of the house, not daring to make known his presence, and perhaps cursing her cowardice. A chill terror seized her. She was afraid to face him. His will was strong and mighty. Her fevered imagination figured it as the wash of a great ocean breaking on the doorstep, threatening to sweep her off into the roaring whirlpool of doom. She threw the door of the room wide and paused as if her duty were done. "No, no," muttered Reb Shmuel, indicating the outer door. It was so near that he always had that opened too. Hannah tottered forward through the few feet of the hall. The cloak and hat on the peg nodded to her sardonically. A wild thrill of answering defiance shot through her. She stretched out her hand towards them. "Fly, fly, it is your last chance," said the blood throbbing in her ears. But her hand dropped to her side, and in that brief instant of terrible illumination Hannah saw down the whole long vista of her future life, stretching straight and unlovely between great blank walls, on, to a solitary grave, knew that the strength had been denied her to diverge to the right or the left, that for her there would be neither exodus nor redemption. Strong in the conviction of her weakness, she noisily threw open the street door. The face of David, sallow and ghastly, loomed upon her in the darkness. Great drops of rain fell from his hat and ran down his cheeks like tears. His clothes seemed soaked with rain. "At last!" he exclaimed in a hoarse, glad whisper. "But what has kept you?" "Baruch haba, welcome art thou who arrivest," came the voice of Reb Shmuel from within, greeting the prophet.
"Hush!" said Hannah. "Listen a moment."
The sing-song undulations of the old rabbi's voice mingled harshly with the wail of the wind. Pour out thy wrath on the heathen who acknowledges thee not, and upon the kingdoms which invoke not thy name. For they have devoured Jacob and laid waste his temple. Pour out thy indignation upon them and cause thy fierce anger to overtake them. Pursue them in wrath and destroy them from under the heavens of the Lord.
"Quick, Hannah," whispered David. "We can't wait a moment more. Put on your things. We shall miss the train."
A sudden inspiration came to her. For answer she drew his ring out of her pocket and slipped it into his hand.
"Good-bye," she muttered in a strange, hollow voice, and slammed the street door in his face.
"Hannah!"
His startled cry of agony and despair penetrated the woodwork, muffled to an inarticulate shriek. He rattled the door violently in unreasoning frenzy.
"Who's that? What's that noise?"
asked the Rebbitzin. "Only some Christian rough shouting in the street," answered Hannah.
It was truer than she knew. The rain fell faster, the wind grew shriller, but the children of the Ghetto basked by their firesides in faith and hope and contentment. Hunted from shore to shore through the ages, they had found the national aspiration, peace, in a country where Passover came without menace of blood. In the garret of No. 1 Royal Street, little Esther Ansell sat brooding, her heart full of vague, tender poetry and penetrated by the beauties of Judaism, which, please God, she would always cling to. Her childish vision looking forward hopefully to the larger life that the years would bring. End of chapter 28 and end of Children of the Ghetto by Israel Zangwill. Recorded by Adrian Praetzellis in Santa Rosa, California, Thanksgiving Day 2013.